Welcome to the Work Trends Podcast, brought to you by Talent Culture. I'm your host, Megan M. Bureau. Every week, I interview smart people reimagining the world of work. Be sure to stay current with all of our interesting podcasts by visiting our page at Talent Culture Work Trends on Apple Podcast or Spotify. And of course, you can listen at talentculture.com on the podcast page. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Talent Culture Work Trends Podcast, sponsored by Comply Right. I'm your host, Megan M. Bureau, and today we are diving into the critical elements of compliance, which have been redefined in the shift towards more remote workforces. We are tapping the expertise of our friends at Comply Right, who help employers navigate the complex web of federal, state, and local employment laws. But before we jump into today's podcast, go ahead, do me a favor. Ask yourself these two questions. Number one, has your organization adjusted its compliance policies to account for remote employees? And number two, do you think your leadership team understands compliant laws well enough? Okay, let's get started. Joining us today is Jamie Lizotte from Comply Right. Jamie is the Director of HR and Tax Products at Comply Right, Inc., a provider of cutting-edge compliance products and programs for businesses. She is passionate about HR and developing products to assist businesses with easing the process of compliance. She has developed products, programs from the ground up, such as a very exciting e-filing platform, as well as transitioned products to newer, updated, more current platforms to keep up with the ever-changing world of work. We are so excited to have you here with us today, Jamie. Let's get started, shall we?
Sounds good. And thank you so much for having me, Megan.
You got it. Let's set the stage here because we are going to talk about compliance. Should we start with the definitions of exempt and non-exempt so our listeners are all on the same page? Because I know I've been listening to you, community, and there are a lot of questions around this topic.
Most definitely. And I think that is a great way to get started, actually. Really set the tone for what we're going to talk about, and everybody will be on the same page. So I want to start with exempt employees. And when it comes to exempt, these are typically the salaried positions, and they have more autonomy, right? They're not subject to overtime pay. And when it comes to exempt employees, they're generally expected to fulfill their job duties regardless of the specific hours worked. Now, when it comes to non-exempt employees, those are the employees that are paid by the hour, and they are entitled to overtime pay if they work beyond a set number of hours per week. So you're talking like that 40 plus hour work week, right? Anything over 40, the employer is obligated to pay those extra hours. And that distinction significantly impacts how they track and manage that employee's time when they're remote. So very important to understand the difference there.
Well, and you just said the word remote, right? While this is basic to some of our listeners, it is foundational information that others may not fully understand just yet. So I am so glad you're here to define and explain what's quite important in following the rules. So tell us, what are some time and pay regulations that employers should be considering with remote workforces?
Well, I love that we started by really explaining exempt and non-exempt, because this is definitely going to be a little bit easier for me to address so everybody can stay along. So non-exempt employees, they should ideally track their hours similar to how they would do it while, if they were still in the office setting. So that would include them clocking in and out for breaks. That would be any break that's exceeding 15 minutes, and even at the end of the workday. However, the key here when it comes to that employee clocking in and out is simply trust, because we're not there to see them, right? And organizations need a system to ensure that their employees are not working on their breaks or even after they're clocking out. And when we're not there, we can't watch. So the importance here is really a clear policy for the organizations to have on breaks and overtime. So that can help avoid issues down the line. And I highly recommend an electronic system when it comes to clocking in and out. Otherwise, you can implement weekly timesheets that the employee would have to fill out and then submit at the end of the week to their managers, and then always require approval of any overtime hours. And also another tip is really to reinforce the fact that all wage and hour policies apply. Having that policy set in place of overtime hours, the clocking in and clocking out really allows you to even have that standard for progressive discipline if it is needed versus, getting yourself into hot water if anything happens.
Well, I have to tell you, this is such great insight. I think learning how to properly understand and communicate this with remote employees, that can be stressful for a lot of leaders, a lot of people out there, a lot of managers. It's a very, very important topic. So, talk to us about some best practices for communication between managers and employees to ensure they're clear about expectations and what's allowed. Like you said earlier, breaks, meals, this can often be kind of fuzzy.
So I do want to go back to the last question you have just to touch upon exempt employees. We did talk about the non-exempt, but with the exempt employees and when it comes to their time and pay, they don't necessarily track hours, but they are expected to fill their job duties. And that is regardless of schedule. So you really want to think of it this way. Exempt employees, they're paid for their results, not the hours worked. And because of this, you're not really required to keep strict time records of their hours worked. So you have a little leeway, obviously, when it comes to the exempt. They're a little easier to maintain, obviously, keep track of. But you obviously want to make sure that they are doing their work, which again is something that you can't watch. So the trust has to be there with both your non-exempt and your exempt employees. So moving on to the next question, we're all aware that the pandemic really forced many companies to adopt remote work quickly, right? And often organizations just jump to say, you guys now need to work from home. We don't have a place for you to come into anymore. So they didn't even have policies established. And now that remote work is becoming the norm for many, it's really critical that these organizations develop clear policies for those remote employees. And these policies should outline expectations regarding normal things, even like what I just mentioned when we were talking about timekeeping for your non-exempt employees, those regarding meal or rest breaks, but there are also some other policies to consider. One area could be time zones. You may have people that are now working in different states. During the pandemic, a lot of people moved around and organizations allowed them to do that. So if your team is spread across different time zones, it's important to have really clear guidelines on the work hours and even the meeting times. So you may have people that are on the West Coast, if your business is on the East Coast, to have to start earlier, or you may allow them to work the regular hours. It just really depends. That's up to the organization. But you want to make sure that they have a clear understanding based on the differences. This, really helps to avoid misunderstandings and definitely make sure everyone feels respected, because we know that working those different hours, sometimes, East Coast has to stay on a little bit longer or West Coast has to wake up a little bit earlier, so where's that happy medium?
Well, this is such a nuanced and critical element of the conversation, right? Clearly, employees need to feel like they can take some breaks like they were in the office. But that can feel nebulous, I think, when working from home. I love having examples about how to do this properly, to set work guidelines, but also honor employees and the trust we have placed in you, in them. And trust is just essential. It really is.
It is. I agree. And another critical area I want to mention, Megan, is security and confidentiality. And that really even goes, into the trust too, because remote employees have access to sensitive company information. And now that company information is being taken out of the office into their own home office. So it's essential to have policies in place to protect that data and to prevent unauthorized access.
You just the light bulb just went off. Let's talk for a brief moment about some of the ways that employers can legally and ethically support the mental and physical well-being of remote employees. That's a whole nother level, right?
Oh, most definitely. And, I love this question. And that you have it for me, because while I'm always focused on the compliance and the laws organizations to follow, because I want to make sure that we remove the burden from those employers, right? But when it comes to an employee's well-being, this can definitely be a gray area. And versus it being solely about compliance, I think it's really more about the care and the concern of the employees within an organization, truly looking out for their employees and having that interest of their overall well-being. And the shift to remote work, it can definitely be challenging. especially for extroverts who thrive on social interaction. You went from being around, if you have a company with 100, 150 people, seeing 100, 150 people a day, depending on what your household looks like, to maybe just you. So beyond the issues you were dealing with during the pandemic, and, not being able to see anybody, you're now, dealing with that with work too. And having to work and just constantly working through just Zoom calls every day, right?
Oh, for sure. We know something about that, right?
We do, very much so. And it's become natural for us. It's become an everyday norm. But it's essential for managers here to check in with their employees regularly. And I think that was a really big step for managers moving out to think outside the box when they went into remote work. How can they get their teams engaged more? And some companies were doing socials even through media. I heard other companies getting together, instead of the outside happy hours or things like that, they figured out ways where they could send a project to their house and do it all together. But just like I said, thinking outside the box. But with remote workers and particularly exempt employees, they can easily fall into the trap of working long hours, obviously leading to what we call burnout, right? And I want to share something that I saw on monster.com. A survey just this year really found, and this is a staggering number, of 69% of remote workers experiencing burnout symptoms.
Yeah. Well, we were burned out before. Chances are now that some of us are remote, and if we're feeling disconnected and then we're feeling like we have to go above and beyond now. This is a big topic. It really is.
Most definitely, and it's not just work, right? On top of work, with remote employees, with children or spouses at home, they may even face additional distractions and interruptions. So that can add to the stress, work overload. And then most definitely a big one is the blurred work-life boundaries, ultimately leading to that burnout. Because when you have a home office, the door is closed, but you can easily walk into that door to do, a work a little bit later or work on the weekends, and things like that. So definitely a big concern there and a big change, and something that a lot of remote workers really had to learn to get to transition into.
Well, I have to say, this is really excellent information, Jamie. I think people sometimes forget that compliance isn't simply rules and regulations. It's in the interest of protecting people. And it's so important to look holistically at how to maintain boundaries for remote workers, but also fully support everybody. All right, last question here. Overall, what compliance pitfalls should our listeners avoid and how?
So this is such a broad question. I could go on for days, but I think there are two really common areas that I'd like to touch upon. And I want to start with posting obligations for remote workers. This is a very common question we get. And it's an area that can get fuzzy again as you move from the office to a remote location. However, by law, you are required to provide those mandatory notices to all employees. Although the regulations, they don't specify the format, whether it's going to be paper or electronic, you are responsible for communicating that same information to your home-based workers or as those on site. So even if they're not home-based, they may be at a different location, right? But without legal specifics on how to address this area of posting compliance, you really need to use your best judgment. So if your remote employees go to an office a few times a month and their current labor law posters are displayed there, then that should be sufficient. They're able to see the rules and regulations that they need to know there. However, if these employees, they don't visit the office as often, then you really want to consider making those notices and the posters available either via email or on an intranet in a format that they can access anytime, because that information needs to be readily available to them anytime that they want to see it. In addition to that, I want to add another layer of complexity. And these are workers that are located in different states. We talked about being in different locations earlier. So this is where complying with posting requirements can actually be particularly problematic if your remote employees work in different states. And many employers, they actually forget that the laws where an employee works and not necessarily where they live dictate things like minimum wage, overtime, and even those safety regulations. So as an example, if you have remote workers in California and Nevada, you might need to comply with both of those states' labor laws. However, in some cases, your out-of-state employees, they may be covered by the laws at the location of your company and the laws of the state where they work. So how do you navigate questions like this, right? Or situations? Well, really, the best way is to provide both sets of those state-specific postings to remote workers. So as an example, if your business is located in California, and you have remote workers in Nevada, you would simply just supply them with both those state postings just to make sure that you're on the safe side. But my main point here, Megan, really is that you must communicate the information that's included in the employee postings to all employees. And that does include those employees that are offsite or that work offsite or at home, and obviously on-site. The law is unclear, though, on the format for doing this, that gray area. And while we recommend the electronic delivery of postings where workers can download, they can even view and acknowledge receipt of all required postings, this does satisfy your obligation to communicate their rights as covered in the mandatory federal and state notices. And another pitfall I do want to share is when it comes to paying remote employees correctly. So we talked about keeping track of their time and everything like that, but what about pay? And a common question is, how can employers ensure that they're paying their remote employees the right amount, especially if they're in different states, kind of going on trend with being in different states? Well, as I mentioned previously, it really is determined when it comes to employees by the state in which the employee performs the work. So the key is to track really where your employees are working and then calculate their wages and overtime based on the specific laws that apply to their location. So if more than one law covers an employee, then generally the way that you lean is towards the law that's more generous to the employee. And it's also important to just communicate clearly with your employees about their pay and any changes that might occur due to the changes in their work location. And of course, if you're really unsure, it's always a good idea to consult with an employment attorney to make sure that you are fully compliant at all times.
Wow, this is great intel. Listeners, we are here to help you in so many ways. And if we help you avoid getting into sticky or costly situations, I'm all for it. This is excellent advice. So thank you so much for stopping by, Jamie. This has been amazing.
Well, thank you for having me, Megan. And what I always say to my listeners when I'm out there doing webinars and whatnot is happy complying, and that's what we're here for.
I feel like we really covered a lot of ground today. Compliance sometimes falls into the must-have category, but I think today's conversation provided some paradigm shifts in how we can communicate with and support our remote employees better. That's a win in my book. Here are a few of the key takeaways. Number 1, compliance with remote workers requires some education and knowledge that you can't just assume is in place. Delegate the responsibility to someone who can fully understand the rules and the regulations that should be followed. Number 2, there are ways to best communicate with the remote employees that illustrate that following the rules is in everyone's best interest. By being clear and direct, confusion can be alleviated. Number 3, ignorance isn't bliss in this corner of the world. Keep your eyes, ears, and doors open for ways to educate yourselves and your team members, pivot when appropriate, and continually explore what remote workers need. Thank you again for being here today, Jamie. It's been an extremely informational and fun conversation. We truly appreciate your time and expertise. And listeners, please be sure to visit complyright.com to learn more and explore resources. And last but not least, the talent culture community wants to hear from you. Number 1, tell us, who handles compliance in your organization? Question 2, do you feel that your organization's remote workers have clear rules and expectations for time and pay regulations? And number 3, what do you think are the best ways to support remote employees and set fair boundaries? Weigh in, visit us on Twitter, X, LinkedIn, and Instagram to share your responses to these questions, or feel free to reach out to me personally at Megan M. Bureau on the socials or mbureau@talentculture.com. And thanks for listening to the Work Trends Podcast, the place to find meaningful connections at work. If you love what we do here, make sure to share our podcast with everyone you know, or send us a question on the socials using the hashtag WorkTrends. See you soon, friends. Thanks for joining us for today's conversation. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Just a reminder that you can hear all the Work Trends podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and on the podcast page at talentculture.com. Be sure to subscribe so you can listen on the go and stay up to date on all the latest news you want to hear. I look forward to catching up with you next time. I hope today's information made you wiser, happier, more informed, and most importantly, thinking of how you can use it to improve the quality of your life.